Worldviews are complex. They don't fit into tidy packages, as much as sometimes we wish they would. The four categories of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny are extremely helpful for getting an initial big picture overview of a worldview. But it won't be uncommon for these categories to overlap. Michelle Tepper's discussion of the Trinity told us much about origin, but equally it taught us about God's purposes in creation, and therefore about meaning. You'll find overlap like this throughout the course, and a good sign that you're engaging well with the material is that you find yourself regularly identifying these points of overlap. The challenge of understanding a worldview is much greater than finding basic answers to the four major categories. A worldview is the world as viewed by people, and people are complex. As you begin to apply your understanding of worldview in conversations, you'll find that to really understand a person, and therefore to understand their view of the world, takes time, patience, prayer, and a willingness to see things from a variety of perspectives. This week, we'll look at the question of meaning, beginning with Ravi's lecture, Can Man Live Without God? By exploring the consequences of living without God, Ravi exposes how meaning and purpose are intimately tied to life lived with God and for God.
Some of you may remember the title, Can Man Live Without God?, from one of my earlier books, which was published in the early 1990s. It came on the heels of a series of lectures delivered at the Harvard Law School at the first ever Veritas Forum. Those words, actually, Can Man Live Without God?, are lifted from Will Durant's popular statement. He said, the greatest question of our time is not going to be East versus West, or North versus South, or communism versus capitalism. The greatest question of our time is going to be, can man live without God? Quite perceptive that a man like him could begin to see the turn in the philosophical underpinnings of our culture, whether humanity was going to continue to embrace the sacred and cling to its ramifications, or whether we were going to sort of wing it from a purely naturalistic framework. And so what Will Durant alerted us to was born, I believe, out of that strident statement, that long, protracted parable, I should say, which came from the pen of Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, born in 1844, died in 1900. The irony of Nietzsche's strident anti-theism was the fact that he was really the son of a minister, and both of his grandfathers were in the ministry. But you recall his parable of the madman. He talks about this man rushing into the marketplace with a lantern, and he's looking for God. I'm looking for God, he says. Where is God? How can I find him? But he says there was silence, and it excited considerable laughter. Nietzsche goes on to show how in his search the madman couldn't find any response to his hunger and the search for God. But Nietzsche was very brilliant and poignant in the way he framed the entailments of a world without God. He talked about things like this. Who gave us a sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? Will lanterns now have to be lit in the morning hours? Is there any up or down left? What sacred games will we need to invent in order to take the place of the God that we have erased and wiped off our horizon? Those are the kinds of questions that Nietzsche realized would need to be answered. Is there an up or down? Meaning, is there a right and wrong? Is there a here and a hereafter? Or is everything now locked in to this 70 years and 10 in what we have? But you know, atheism became popularized after Nietzsche's parable and gained a lot of momentum from philosophers and so on. Then it started to sort of wane and die down. But all of a sudden, in the last half a dozen years or so, with the onset of Richard Dawkins's writings, Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris, and many of that genre of writers, as they began to talk about atheism, they gained this new boldness, this new worldview that was going to displace what they call this tooth fairy belief in God, and so on. Etienne Born, the philosopher from France, defined for us what atheism is. And I think it's important we follow these two definitions, one from Etienne Born and one from Paul Edwards in his Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The reason I think it is important is because the modern-day atheists very cleverly straddle the line between atheism and agnosticism. Some of them will say, we're really not saying there is no God. What we're trying to say is there is no evidence for God, and therefore we will live in this no man's land of assuming God didn't exist. But listen to what Etienne Born has to say about what atheism really is. Here's his definition. Atheism is the deliberate, definite, dogmatic denial of the existence of God. It is not satisfied with approximate truth or even relative truth, but claims to see the ins and outs of the game quite clearly, being the absolute denial of the absolute. Now, Born didn't have any dog in this fight here. He's just defining what atheism is in its essence. Paul Edwards, in Volume 1, page 175 of his multiple volume set on the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, says this: an atheist is a person who maintains that there is no God. That is, that the sentence God exists expresses a false proposition, and a person who rejects belief in God. So this is a dogmatic denial of the existence of the person of God and the absolutes that follow as a result. Yeah, this comes from naturalistic thinkers, from the scientists who want to keep that as sort of the pristine, basic, positive way of looking at the world, and no other discipline ultimately has to say anything about it. Now listen to a scientist, David Berlinski, who is an avowed agnostic. David Berlinski, responding to Richard Dawkins's book, The God Delusion, penned a book called The Devil's Delusion. And in the flap cover of his book, here's what he has to say. It's fascinating. Has anyone provided a proof of God's inexistence? Not even close. Has quantum cosmology explained the emergence of the universe or why it is here? Not even close. Have the sciences explained why our universe seems to be fine-tuned to allow for the existence of life? Not even close. Are physicists and biologists willing to believe in anything so long as it is not religious thought? Close enough. Has rationalism in moral thought provided us with an understanding of what is good, what is right, and what is moral? Not close enough. Has secularism in the terrible 20th century been a force for good? Not even close to being close. Is there a narrow and oppressive orthodoxy of thought and opinion within the sciences? Close enough. Does anything in the sciences or in their philosophy justify the claim that religious belief is irrational? Not even in the ballpark. Is scientific atheism a frivolous exercise in intellectual contempt? Dead on. Now, the reason I position Berlinski over against Etienne Born and Paul Edwards' definition and the writings of Dawkins and Hitchens and Samuel Harris and Dennett and so on is because to tell you that even within the camp of atheist or agnostic thinkers, this rabid stridency which atheism now proffers to you and me is really not a unilateral decision. It's not a univocal decision. The fact of the matter is there are many in the camp on these worldviews that actually have a strong disagreement with the atheistic, or what I like to talk about as the anti-theistic way of defining the world. The fact is, for you as you're studying this and trying to come to terms with it, I think it is wise if you're strong enough to take the best of the thinking on these issues and come to your conclusion on how strong these arguments are. I recall in my days at Cambridge University when I was taking a course in quantum theory from the famed quantum physicist John Polkinghorne, how strongly committed he was as a Christian. I have met some very fine scientists across the globe who talk about how strong their faith is in God, or others who talk about how strong they are as in their atheistic thinking. So obviously it is not science by itself that logically leads to the conclusion. Other disciplines and other arguments are brought head on. What then develops as a result of this? Think, for example, if humanism now is at the center stage, and the way to define humanity and all that we must pursue takes center stage, you would think, therefore, that there is just one line of reasoning that emerges as a result from these naturalists. It doesn't. There are actually 7 different forms of humanism. The evolutionary humanism of Julian Huxley, behavioral humanism of B.F. Skinner, the existential humanism of Jean-Paul Sartre, the pragmatic humanism of Dewey, the Marxist humanism of Marx and Feuerbach, egocentric humanism of Ayn Rand, which has become more popular of late, and the cultural humanism of Carlos Lamont. You see what I mean here? You would think the difference between Marxist humanism and Ayn Rand's humanism would be worlds apart, and they are, but they both go back to an atheistic substructure, trying to define the world and economics and all from a naturalistic framework. So here's what I want to take you through in a journey. If God doesn't exist, or put a spin on that from my point of view, why do I think it is logically impossible to build a coherent worldview apart from God? Let me repeat that statement. Why do I think it is logically impossible to build a coherent worldview apart from God? You will remember when we were talking about the test for truth, we talked about correspondence and we talked about coherence. So here's what the naturalist does. Takes a naturalistic definition of the world, brings in some corresponding arguments, and then extrapolates into all kinds of deductions. But the coherence totally falls apart when you look at life apart from God. I think 4 entailments are obvious. Number 1, if God doesn't exist, you are unable to find an absolute moral law or an imperative of what is essentially good and essentially evil. Now, I'm not talking about pragmatically. People come out with theories like, why should we kill each other? Why should we destroy each other? If we all are honest with each other, we make a better living and so on. But I know people can argue from those pragmatic viewpoints, but that doesn't tell me what is essentially good in and of itself. Somebody may decide it's pragmatically more worthwhile for him or her to lie on the research in the lab in order to benefit some pharmaceutical company and gain some ground personally or corporately. Essential good and essential evil falls by the wayside. When you turn your back upon an absolute good and evil, all kinds of struggles begin in human existence. Now listen, for example, to 2 authors who clearly pointed this out to us, and then some others I will support it with in others of their quotes. But Hobart Maurer, who committed suicide in 1982 at the age of 75, was a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. For 4 years he was instructor at Yale, and 8 years was president at Harvard, and one time president of the American Psychological Association. He wrote an article quite well before he died called Sin, the Lesser of 2 Evils. And he said he got more response from his readership hostile towards him, although he himself was an avowed agnostic and an atheist, possibly. He said, when I wrote this, I wrote it for pure psychological well-being, psychological reasons. And the hostility, he said, stunned him. But here's what he said. For several decades, we psychologists have looked upon the whole matter of sin and moral accountability as a great incubus and acclaimed our liberation from it as epoch-making. But at length we have discovered, notice now please, to be free in this sense. That is, to have the excuse of being sick rather than being sinful is to court the danger of also becoming lost. This danger is, I believe, says Maurer, betokened by the widespread interest in existentialism which we are presently witnessing. In becoming amoral, ethically neutral, and free, we have cut the very roots of our being, lost our deepest sense of selfhood and identity, and with neurotics themselves now find ourselves asking, who am I? What is my deepest destiny? What does living really mean? And then he quoted the famed Anna Russell in her psychiatric folk song. At 3, I had a feeling of ambivalence towards my brothers, and so it followed naturally. I poisoned all my lovers. Now I'm happy I have learned the lesson this has taught, that everything I do that's wrong is someone else's fault. You know, when you scroll back into that thought of what Maurer actually said, notice the word he used. In losing the sense of sin, we have actually become lost. You'd think he's actually talking as a theologian out there, because he says we've lost the very essence of our being. What it is that Maurer is telling us is that the moral framework is indispensable to understanding who we are as human beings. And in losing this vertical dimension of sin, we've lost the definition of who we are. Viktor Frankl, who 3 times was imprisoned under the Nazis and spent time in Auschwitz, writes this: if we present man with a concept of man which is not true, we may well corrupt him. When we present him as an automaton of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drives and reactions, as a mere product of instincts, heredity, and environment, we then feed the nihilism to which modern man is in any case prone. I became acquainted with the last stage of corruption in my second concentration camp, Auschwitz. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were ultimately the consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of heredity and environment, or as the Nazis like to say, of blood and soil. I am absolutely convinced, says Frankl, that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek were ultimately prepared not in some ministry or other in Berlin, but rather at the desks and in the lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers. I want to say something to you that's very sobering to me personally here. I remember in the 1980s, while the Cold War was still raging, I was invited to Poland to speak in Krakow and Warsaw. And on an off day, my host, who was a medical doctor, asked me if I'd like to be driven to Auschwitz. I said to him, I've been to many concentration camps. He said, no, I'm not talking about a concentration camp. I'm talking about a death camp. Have you been to a death camp? I talked about Buchenwald and Dachau. He said, no, you want to go to a death camp. So we got into the car on that cold day. It was foggy and just a little snow falling and all of that. And we drove the distance, and we arrived in Auschwitz. I have to tell you, as a man much younger at that time, I wasn't prepared for what I was going to see. Now, you need to know, when I was in my 20s doing my undergraduate in theology, I was taken to Vietnam and Cambodia. I saw some horrific things there that changed my life, that shaped my calling, that really God poured into my heart at that point, to be driving through the highways of Vietnam and seeing the ravages of human life and all that went on. I wasn't emotionally prepared for what I was going to see in Auschwitz. Do you know, in Auschwitz alone, they were exterminating them at the rate of 12,000 every day. Think about it. 12,000 every day. You go past a room where you see thousands of pounds of women's hair stashed behind glass, just piled up to the ceiling, as it were. And you saw all that was done to them in pictures before they were taken into the gas ovens. This hair was then woven into sacks and sold in the marketplace. They were brought into these gas chambers, hundreds of them huddled together, told they were about to have their first shower in days. Unknown to them that lethal gas was being turned on from the ceilings, as literally masses of flesh were leaning against each other, and they were obliterated. The words of Adolf Hitler now are there as you enter that gas chamber. Here's what he said. I want to raise a generation of young people devoid of a conscience, imperious, relentless, and cruel. The desks, the lecture halls of the universities, young people poisoned with this kind of thinking, to be able to kill their own fellow human beings. Imagine those living in the vicinity of Auschwitz seeing the smoke coming out of the chimneys and getting the smell of flesh being burned. This kind of stuff that went on. And if you read Hannah Arendt's book on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, and if I remember correctly, Hannah Arendt was actually married to Martin Heidegger, or was his mistress. Heidegger, the existentialist, who couldn't bring himself to condemn the Holocaust. And yet, here was Hannah Arendt in her closing line said, what happened there was the ultimate trivialization of evil. The trivialization of evil. Where does the naturalist get off on all of this? How does he or she find a point of reference when you cannot go to an absolute because it's an absolute denial of the absolute in a being and therefore by implications the moral law? Kai Nielsen, the Canadian philosopher, he talks about this struggle. He's also a strident atheist himself. But here's what Nielsen says. We have not been able to show that reason requires the moral point of view, or that really rational persons, unhoodwinked by myth or ideology, need not be individual egoists or classical amoralists. Did you hear what he said there just now? Unhoodwinked by myth or ideology, which means religious thought is to be hoodwinked by myth. But if you're unhoodwinked by that, there's no reason for you not to be an egoist or an amoralist. Then he goes on, reason doesn't decide here. The picture I have painted for you is not a pleasant one. Reflection on this depresses me. Pure, practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality. Now, I didn't say that. That's an atheist talking. Another famous philosopher, Richard Rorty, who, by the way, could not again talk in condemnation of the Holocaust. He just said, I find it personally abhorrent and it's a horrific thing to even look at. But Rorty goes on to say, if moral imperatives are not commanded by God's will, and if they are not in some sense absolute, then what ought to be good is simply a matter of what men and women decide should be good. There is no other source of judgment. You know, I could go at length on this. I urge you to look at Sam Harris's book where he tries to introduce moral reasoning apart from God. Nothing new is introduced there. The fact of the matter is, human beings have to be defined in essential worth in order for evil to be defined as evil. So without God, there's no moral law. Without God, there's no meaning. How do we find meaning in this world? What do we do with things like love? What do we do with things like relationships? What do we do with things like honor and trust? How do we find meaning in a life where we just find individual particular meanings, but no ultimate meaning for life itself? I've often said, if you read my book, Recapture the Wonder, meaning must have 4 components: wonder, truth, love, and security. That's what ultimately brings meaning. And then, without God, there is no hope. Life comes to a tragic end at the end when you pass away. That's the way life meets its terminus. No justice beyond the grave, no relationship beyond the grave, no more meeting point once again beyond the grave. Life has come to a cold, sudden end, like an engine stopping in the middle of the sky. No moral law, no meaning, no hope, and ultimately no recovery. What do I mean by that? Pascal is often misunderstood. He's thought to be sort of a gambler, in gambling this idea of God or no God, that that's what he did. No. That's not what he said. That was not the context in which he said it. He said it in the context of an existential point versus counterpoint. For the existentialist, meaning and fulfillment is an experience alone. And so he said, I meet the test of the existentialist. Should a man be in error in supposing the Christian religion to be true, he could not be a loser by mistake. But how irreparable is his loss, and how inexpressible his danger, who should err in supposing it to be false. He's not gambling here. He's just telling you this to the existentialist. You want me to meet your test? I have found fulfillment in your test in this world. But you have not met my test. If reason holds sway, and truth holds sway, and God exists, after you die, how do you then recover all that was lost in a life lived antitheistically or against God? You know, friends, I think how you talk to an atheist ought to be with courtesy and with respect. We're not saying here that an atheist is a bad person. That is the wrong extension of what is being said. We are just saying there is no logically compelling reason for morality. At best, you can pragmatically argue for it. But since they argue existentially and naturalistically from a logical perspective, there is no logically compelling reason for a moral law. Survival is all that really matters. Nature is red in tooth and claw. Do you remember a rock group years ago writing this song? King Crimson, I believe, was the name of that. Cat's Foot, Iron Claw, neurosurgeons scream for more, from paranoia's poison door, 21st century schizoid man. Blood rack, barbed wire, politicians' funeral pyre, innocents raped with napalm fire, 21st century schizoid man. Death seed, blind man's greed, poets starving, children bleed, nothing he's got he really needs, 21st century schizoid man. The walls on which the prophets wrote is cracking at the seams. Upon the instruments of death the sunlight brightly gleams. Will no one lay the laurel wreath as silence drowns the screams? Between the iron gates of fate the seeds of time are sown, and watered by the deeds of those who know and who are known. Knowledge is a deadly friend when no one sets the rules. The fate of all mankind, I see, is in the hands of fools. Confusion will be my epitaph as I crawl a cracked and broken path. If we make it, we can all sit back and laugh. But I'm afraid tomorrow I'll be crying. Andrew Fletcher, the Scottish political activist, said, "Let me write the songs of a nation. I don't care who writes its laws." And you know, the songwriters of the day tell it like it is. I'm afraid tomorrow I'll be crying. Can man live without God? Only if he wants to live with no moral law, no ultimate hope, no intrinsic meaning, and if he or she is wrong, no ultimate recovery. Douglas Copeland was a Canadian writer who tried this and wrote a book called Life Without God. He traces his youth with many other young people in Western Canada and how they all went in different directions, all having abandoned God. And at the end of his book, he makes this extraordinary statement. Here's what he says in his book, Life After God. "Now here is my secret. I tell you with an openness of heart that I doubt I shall ever achieve again. So I pray you're in a quiet room as you hear these words. My secret is that I need God, that I am sick and can no longer make it alone. I need God to help me give because I no longer seem capable of giving, to help me be kind as I no longer seem capable of kindness, to help me love as I seem beyond being able to love. I need God." That's what he said. Chuck Templeton, who walked away from God, Chuck, a good friend of Billy Graham, when he was asked years later what he thought about Jesus, he said, "I miss him." The person of God, revealed in Christ, is the answer to life. And those who deny the existence of God and the Savior provided by him ultimately end up with no moral law, no hope, no meaning, and if they're wrong, no recovery. Think on these things.